What's the most disturbing secret you've discovered about someone close to you? The 24 hours before my dad died, stage 4 lung cancer, he was in the ER and then the ICU, and we were unable to be with him because of hospital COVID rules. My mother, sister, and myself had been texting and calling him all day and got no response. My mother even called the hospital and spoke with one of his ICU nurses, who said he was awake and communicating fine. He passed very quickly at 3:30 a.m. the next morning. We were allowed to be at his bedside, but by then he was no longer conscious, so we said our goodbyes and he was gone. Later that morning, while my mom slept, I was calling cremation services to schedule his body for pickup at the hospital. And going through his bag of belongings, the hospital had returned to us. His phone was in there, and I wanted to read all our texts and take some comfort in my last words to him. I opened his phone and all our texts had not been read, not mine or my mom and sister's. I thought this was so odd, but figured he must have been suffering so much he couldn't find the strength. I began to scroll through his apps and noticed a chat app I'd vaguely heard of. I can't recall the name, but it essentially works like WhatsApp. I opened the app and saw a single contact with a female name. I started reading and realized my dad has been chatting with this girl hourly for the last 24 hours and as far back as I could scroll. He was calling her princess and telling her he loved her, and she was saying she was scared for him and wanted to know what was going on. Why was he in the ER, etc. I scrolled back enough to know that this was someone he was having, at the very least, an emotional affair with. My grief was completely hijacked by hurt and anger, and a week later I tracked the girl down and spoke to her via DMS, and found out she was 19 years old. She was 17 when they met. He was her high school bus driver, and she told me they had been dating for almost 2 years. My dad was 66 years old when he died, and dating someone younger than his grandchildren, someone he chose to spend his last moments with and say his last goodbyes to. I hope it made him happy, but it sure is a shitty secret to live the rest of my life with. A secret that will forever overshadow my entire relationship with my dad, with no chance to ever speak to him about it. It's the one secret I wish I'd never found out. I couldn't imagine finding something like that out. You must feel so helpless to the whole situation. I think I'd have done exactly the same in your situation, and I hope you can find some sort of peace. I feel this one. Mom found out about a similar scenario accidentally when she was on a holiday with my dad. He still maintains he has no idea what she saw and nothing is going on. I'm glad therapy is helping you. I'm sorry you had to find out like that. Can I ask, when did your dad find out about the lung cancer diagnosis? As sometimes these things do weird things to people. He had his first symptoms in November. Official diagnosis at the beginning of the December. He passed on January 15th. It was all so fast. I have questioned whether or not he might have known before and just never told anyone or got treatment. Certainly would explain the strange behavior. My mom says he never showed any signs of illness until that November. He was very active until the day he couldn't catch his breath while hanging Christmas lights. I don't know how disturbing this is. It turned out pretty fantastic for one, but not for another. I was adopted and told a silly, magical story about my birth parents that most certainly did not seem true even when I was a child. At 57, I learned I was the result of a college affair between a very seriously Jewish young man and a very Baptist young woman. She was rushed off to a home for wayward girls to give birth. He followed her there, many states away, begging her to keep me and live a life together. But their families both said absolutely not. Jewish people were not viewed as white in the mid-60s, and her family most certainly did not want her marrying a non-white. Plus, she was a very committed Christian, and did not want to convert to Judaism. So off I went into another family. I recently discovered 3 lovely half-siblings, and we are all pro or semi-pro musicians and get along well. I never got to meet my mother. She died a year before I searched. My father is out of the picture and wants to be left alone, and I'm fine with that. I'm grateful for the love he gave me. It was enough. Another person that was in my non-bio family was also adopted. She was older than me. She tracked down her mom later in life too. She was in a hospital and had been since the day she was born. She was born holistically disabled. Physical, mental, cognitive, learning, sensory, and was raped by an orderly. And she discovered she was the result. Endings to our searching are not always happy. I'm an adoptee and have found my biological mother. She never talked about how she became pregnant with me, nor did she give me the name of my biological father. She has since passed. Sometimes I think that I may be better off not knowing. That's awful, and so difficult to process for her. I hope she had the support she needed. Were they able to identify her father? It would be so difficult as to whether you wanted to know in that situation. Heartbreaking. An uncle beat a guy almost to death with his bare hands. He had walked in on a friend molesting a kid. He had to pay a fine and do community service for a long time, but also didn't have to pay for beer at the local bar for a few months. He was so reserved and kind, so it threw me when I found out what he'd accomplished in his younger years. The reason Grandma moved away when my dad was still a baby to a big city, more than 3 days away from her family, was because she stabbed her stepfather and almost killed him. It was a very small village. Later, she told me he was a racist. She didn't elaborate on that, and I didn't ask any follow-up questions. She ended the convo with, "I did the right thing." We never met her side of the family. One of my friends did jail time. Dude's stepfather, been in his life since he was 14, and they had a daughter, 15-year age gap. My friend went over unexpectedly, has a house key, and walked in on his stepfather teaching his sister. In a rage, stabbed him, and he died from wounds. The mother knew it was happening but did nothing about it, and was more angry at my friend for murdering her partner than at the partner for teaching a 6-year-old. The sister is in high school now and is mentally fucked because of everything that had happened. My mate got a very minimal sentencing given the circumstance. He refuses to talk to the mother, and when he got out, he started doing really well for himself and took on caring for his sister because the mum became a drug addict. Blames him for that because of the trauma he caused her. We'll have nothing but the utmost respect for what he did. I'm quite close to the sister as well, and she's doing better since doing therapy. The mother also refused to put her in therapy and pretended nothing had happened. She was my best friend of 7 years. We had literally been through it all together. I moved out of state with my now husband, but she convinced us both to move back to be closer with her after about a year. We had no real ties to the state we had tried out, so we said, screw it. Let's go back. She's basically family. We were all so happy to be reunited. She was over almost every night for dinner. We all laughed and talked and had a blast. Best year of my life. Then slowly, she started trying to turn my husband and I against each other. Any time we had an argument, like any couple does, she would text each of us about how right we were, trying to foster animosity between the two of us. With me, she started talking about how she had a plan B for us, that if my husband and I couldn't make it work, I could move in with her and we'd live happy lives together. With my husband, she started talking about her infertility issues and how she wanted to have a kid just like him. She just needed a sperm donor. This all happened at around the same time, and my husband and I compared texts and figured it out. She wanted to take his sperm and have a baby with me. When confronted about it, she refused to admit anything and started lashing out at both of us. It got to the point where she would show up unannounced, banging on the door, demanding a place in our home. It was so terrifying and panic-inducing that we ended up having to move and change our phone numbers. I guess it's so disturbing because I had never had a friend like her, only to find out that she cared about me, but in such an unhealthy and scary way. But yeah, that's my story. Husband and I are great now. Okay, so let me get this straight. She had an undying love for you and thought you felt the same and figured she could still have a baby with you if the sperm donor was your husband? Correct. It's hard for me to wrap my head around even now. I found out that my aunt, who was 13 at the time, was taught by her uncle, my great-uncle, and had a baby in a cellar in the basement of her house. The baby didn't make it, so she and her little sister buried it there. Years later, when the aunt, who had repressed those memories, had a baby, she remembered it all. When her family found out, she was labeled the slut of the family. My dad's side is garbage. People are trash. When I became pregnant from a sexual assault, random acquaintance, not family, thank God. My dad's side of the family, thankfully not my dad, he loves her, told me I was gonna burn in hell for being a whore. I don't talk to them. My kids don't talk to them, and my dad doesn't talk to them. It hurts when you're going through a trauma like that and your family turns on you. That my mom cheated on my dad for 20 years and still hasn't told him to this day. I'm still trying to figure out what to do and how to go about the situation and exposing the truth about her to my dad, but I'm afraid he would die of a broken heart. Worst thing is, she cheated with my godfather, who used to come to the house and drink coffee with my mom and dad every day. As a kid who found out that one parent was cheating on the other, there's no good time to tell them. My brother, 14, and I, 18, both discovered that our dad was cheating on our mom separately and kept putting off telling her for over a year because it was Christmas. And then she had a business trip. And then it was her birthday, and then it was this, and then it was that, etc. One day, I got in trouble and my dad said, "You're a disgrace to this family," and out flew the words that he and mom were not prepared for. I know it's hard. I know it will change everything if you tell your dad or confront your mom. Just wanted to give you some solidarity. A work colleague appeared on the front page of a national newspaper for a life of fraudulent qualifications. He claimed medical and law degrees, was a brigadier in the Army Reserves, and was the CEO for a major Heath fund. He actually was a brigadier in the Army Reserves, but that and the Heath fund role were largely built on the fraudulent qualifications and a progression of jobs also based on these claims. In reality, the only qualification he actually held was as a mortuary assistant. Not even his wife knew. The fraudulent degrees had been gained when he was in the Army Reserves recruiting, and he had access to submitted position applications. He came undone when he applied for a government job and some flags were raised by the recruitment people. He tried to withdraw the application, but didn't realize that an application for a government role has the same weight as a statutory declaration and cannot be withdrawn. It all went south very quickly, and he ended up doing jail time. He should have stayed away from government jobs. Could have worked out quite well for him. People who worked with him said he was generally competent, although he was well known for far-fetched stories, particularly if they started to question his claims. The positions he was filling were largely administrative, just leadership positions, and didn't rely on him having medical law degrees, so they simply got him to the front of the queue in the interview process. Nevertheless, he was successful in the roles. When it all came out, he was an utter embarrassment to the recruitment industry and ended up being used as a training example for background checks. A former friend of mine from childhood was a youth pastor at a summer church camp. Turns out he was young girls and teens, both at camp and online after camp was over. Only reason I found out was back in 2011, he was in his late 20s at the time, One of the girls told her parents, and the cops posed as her online, while he baked into a webcam. The cop then convinced him to drive 3 hours to go meet and hook up. When he showed up at the girl's place in the middle of the night, the cops were waiting and arrested him. He's now a convicted and did time in jail. The crazy part? Once he got out, he moved to Texas and married a divorcee that had kids. He's also now the dean of online studies at his church and is responsible for growing the number of students taking classes online. I wish, with all my heart, that there was a special job out there where all the person does is follow these sick people around and make their lives a living hell. Like you could just follow them around to their places of work or the neighborhood and give out pamphlets about the person and their record to anyone and everyone. I know that's not at all how the world works, but would honestly be great. I was pretty close with my youngest uncle growing up, at least in pictures. He was in his mid-20s when I was like 5, for context. One day, when I was in middle school, he just stopped coming around completely. My entire family told us kids that he was backpacking around the nation. In high school, I was doing a genealogy project on my grandfather, his dad, and accidentally found my uncle's name on the sex offender registry. Come to find out, he was running a CP ring and had served 16 years in federal prison. He's out now, and my family pretends nothing happened. I stay far away. Wait, when you say my family pretends nothing happened, do you mean that he's back at family gatherings and stuff after being released for CP? He isn't allowed around children or firearms unsupervised, but yes, they talk to him every week and act like nothing happened. He was around all of us when my grandpa passed away. That's how my family operates. They insist he took the fall for his stepfather and didn't do anything wrong. After I found him on the registry, I confronted my mom, and she told me his stepfather is the real bad guy and he didn't do anything. I made a Pacer account a few years ago to see his case information because something felt off, and that's how I found out he was leading a CP ring and creating CP. My mom received birthday cards with money in them for years from her parents. She kept the cards with the money in them, saving to buy a piano sentimental reasons. My sister, who has repeatedly stolen from family members, found the collection of cards' money and took them. My mom only wanted the cards back when she realized what happened. My sister denied everything. Fuck you, Emily. While my cousin was walking around with her son in the woods, she came across a hunting stand. She climbed it and found a pair of binoculars. Sitting straight forward and lifting the binoculars to her eyes, she saw her own bedroom window. Let's be logical here. If it was a legit hunting stand, it was facing and closer than 500 feet to a residence, which is illegal, which means it had to come down with prejudice. If it was a peeping Tom, well, it had to come down with prejudice. When my brother and I visited not long after, she showed us where it was. We tore it down and literally wrapped it around a couple of trees. Bent the fucker to complete uselessness. I got an angry call the next day. Did you tear down a hunting stand yesterday? Fuck yeah, I did. That was your uncle's, her mother's brother. Turns out my cousin reported it to the family and they ignored the issue. When the uncle was asked, he said there was just an old tree house out there. Even when he was exposed, they didn't really care. They were more upset about the damage we did. Suffice it to say, I have written off most of that side of the family. Edit. The uncle in question is now dead. Died June 16th, though. Met a super nice guy at a networking event when I was just starting out in tech. He had a ton of connections and was a nice family man. Super rich. Eventually, we became friends and he was acting as a mentor figure to me in the industry. Went over to his massive new house, met his family, etc. He had the demeanor and looked like Al Borland from Home Improvement, to give you an idea. Like 4 years later, I was looking at the sex offender registry map for my local area while I was shopping for houses. Lo and behold, his house popped up. In the early 2000s, he was convicted of co-running a commercial child porn sales site. Served 5 years for it in federal prison. My former church youth pastor was teaching an acquaintance of mine for years and inadvertently caused his death. I met this boy and the youth pastor when I was in middle school. The boy was gay, and it was pretty well known. He was not a regular member of the church, just occasional teen group activities. The first time I ever met the youth pastor, I asked a friend if he was gay. They told me I was crazy. Well, I wasn't. This man was beloved by everyone, and I mean loved. He was the youth leader for over a decade. The last time I ever saw the boy, we were about 16. I ran into him at a store. He told me what had been happening all these years, and that he was finally strong enough to expose him. He told me that either he was going to make the youth pastor confess to the church, or he would go to the police. As far as I know, he followed through with this confrontation, because the very next week, the head pastor announced to the church that our youth pastor was quitting, moving back to his home state to go work at the grocery store he used to work at. Yes, a freaking grocery store. They threw him a farewell party. I never saw the boy again, but I do know he didn't get justice, because the youth pastor did exactly what he told the church he was going to do. The boy went into a tailspin, as his cousin told me, years later, was depressed and got hooked on drugs. He overdosed when we were 19. I have lived with this for years and kick myself for not saying something too. I don't know if I can now. If anyone thinks I can and something will be done, I do know where that youth pastor is now. After my husband died in 2020, I found out he had been having an affair with a 30-year-old. He was 55. She apparently aborted his baby. Everything he told me about his prior life was a lie. Second marriage for both of us. And he had been having sex with men since he was in his early 20s. To sum it up, I didn't know this man at all. We had been together 10 years and married for 6. Wait, he was having an affair with a woman, got her pregnant, and having sex with men too? Where do people find this kind of time? He was an executive who left home at the crack of dawn. He was leaving work at 2 to meet this woman, visiting men at bathhouses downtown at lunch. He never went out at night. It's doable. Unbelievable, but doable. When I was young, I had vague ideas about my uncle being dodgy, in that, at family events such as weddings, etc., my parents would tell me and some of my cousins to stay away from him. When I was in year 8, we were doing a lesson in citizenship class where we had to cut out pieces from a newspaper. No idea why. And I came across an article saying he'd been recommitted to Broadmoor Prison. Went home and Googled him and found out he'd been in prison in the 80s for kidnapping and raping someone, and had been in and out of prison since for other offenses. He also tried to sue the Sun once for defamation since they printed something incorrect about him. He was awarded 1 pence by the court because it technically was defamation, but it was agreed that what they had printed couldn't have damaged his reputation any further. All I know is that he was in a halfway house for a long time. However, from what I've gathered, he was released around 5 years ago. Tragic and horrifying story all around, but the 1 pence judgment due to his worthless reputation is the best court story I've heard in a while. I wasn't close to this person, but I did hang out with them a few times. The best man at my wedding had another really close friend who turned out to be a serial killer. It messed him up really badly. He already had mental health issues, and this sent him over the edge. I can't even talk to him anymore. I miss you, man. I found out when I was an adult that my mother didn't just abandon me one day after work like I had been led to believe. Turns out, she had been gang raped. She said they took her wallet and made a disgusting comment about my picture inside. I would have been a toddler at this time, and she was just too scared to go home. She said they followed her. She said when it was over, and my stepdad took her to the hospital, they had to stitch everything back together down there. She spent that time away on and off the psych ward. My mom and I still have a rocky relationship. for reasons beyond this, but I definitely understand her better. She's had issues with drinking and her mental health all my life, and I really think it's because she's never sought proper help for what happened to her. Underneath all that trauma, drinking, and grief is my mother, and she's one of the most beautiful souls that'll ever walk this earth. For clarification, she stayed in my life, just my grandparents raised me. There was a lot of other drama as well, but none of it worth getting into. One night, as a kid, I heard my parents having an explosive argument in their bedroom, which suddenly went quiet. The door was closed and locked. I found out during a drunk phone call from my mother. It was because she attempted to shoot my father in the face with a .303, but it didn't go off when she pulled the trigger, as there were no bullets. They were both horrified and just stared at each other, apparently. They're still together.